All right, so you guys, we're here for a webinar today provided by Help Systems. This is the state of IBM security.
The
Three
big reveal.
takeaways. Yeah, three takeaways for 2022. We do this every year, and Robin has a lot of experience with this, so I'm excited that he's going to share this information with you guys today. Robin's our Director of Security Technologies. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm a pretty tenured help systems person at this point. I'm going on I think 13 years at last count, but I've been on the platform for more than 30. Been an IBM champion for a handful of those. I'm in risk and compliance as well. I'm a certified auditor, so kind of walk both lines. But I've been doing the security study now for every year since 2009. So yeah, I've been doing it quite a while.
Quite a while, yeah. And I think I started joining you on these for about 5 years ago, and it's always been interesting, that's for sure. I'm Sandi Moore. I'm a principal security consultant here with Help Systems. Haven't been on the IBMI as long as Robin, but I've certainly been around for a while, about 19 years. So definitely security is high interest to me, and I kind of geek out on it. So it's a
Well,
good
you're way
place to be.
younger than me, so it's understandable that you count it in decades. So, all right. So, help systems. I'm sure many of you are already aware, but from a product perspective, we've got a whole slew of different products that work on IBMI. But we also have what you may not be aware of is an entire set of brands that are for security on multi-platform. So the acquisition business for us has been very busy over the last couple of years. I think we were at 11, 12 acquisitions over the last 18 months. So this is a very exciting time to be part of Help Systems, but it just simply means that we're not constrained by any particular technology or platform. So don't just think of us as an IBMI solution provider, although that is still a big focus of ours. We do a lot within Linux and Windows and everywhere else as well. The other big differentiator that I always point to with help systems is that we're not just about software. We do have people that are very skilled in the operating system. So if you're looking for assistance with setting up the intrusion detection system or doing single sign-on, things that are included in the operating system, or mitigating security in general, we have a whole team of people that they really arguably just do OS stuff all day, every day. So that might be helpful to you as well. We are a member of the PCI Security Standards Council, and of course, relevant to the conversation today, we are the publisher of the annual State of IBMI Security Study. It's been around now since 2004, so coming up on 20 years on that bad boy, but happy to share the 2022 version of that with you, or some of the stats from that today. So before I jump into this one, I always like to set the stage a little bit so people understand what on earth we're talking about here. But since the beginning, back in 2004, there were three primary objectives established for this security study. And that's to really help understand whether there are security exposures when we are running on a platform with a reputation such as the one that IBMI has. We need to understand so that we're not just ignoring and blindly assuming. In that instance, then, if there are challenges, we need to make sure that we are focusing on those top areas of concern. Most likely, there is going to be some prioritization necessary in mitigation activities. Most of us don't have endless amounts of money and endless amounts of resources just sitting around twiddling their thumbs, so we need to prioritize. In the study is useful in regards to pointing at the high-risk items versus maybe lower-risk items. And all of this is really designed to support any effort that IT may establish to justify having a security project on IBMI versus facing some of the popular misinformation that is either out there or, to be fair, many of us have shared from misunderstanding perhaps where IBMI stands from a security perspective. The data that we use for the security study is collected through a rapid scan tool. It's called Security Scan. It's a process that we offer to the IBMI community. It is a Windows application. It runs typically in less than 60 seconds. It is non-invasive, meaning we don't change anything. We're not messing with your config. We're just auditing the environment. We're scanning from the inside out, a little bit different from how I think many of you are probably doing security scans, where it is perhaps looking for open ports, things like that. We're actually checking out 7 configuration areas. We're pulling that configuration setting and we're reporting on it, documenting it, and providing visibility to it. Now, I do acknowledge it's not intended to be an audit grade review. The intention is to kind of get that initial visibility of your system, although I will say that we do this with a lot of tenured people, the people who have been on the box a long, long time, and often they come out of that conversation with their head spinning around because we do provide a ton of useful information here. So don't think that it's just very superficial. There's a lot of great conversation that gets had as part of that process. Out of that, the benefit to you is that you end up with a tangible document. There's actually a vulnerability assessment that is yours to keep. You're welcome to share it with anybody that you wish, and you have access to that. If you are not familiar with security, or maybe not overly familiar with security on IBMI, then we also make consultants available to help interpret those results and work through the findings with you. And the best part of that is that we don't charge for any of those pieces. We don't charge for the use of that Windows tool. We don't charge for the consulting to review the findings with you. And there is zero obligation out of it that you have to buy something at the end. We're not trying to sell you a timeshare, so that's good. It is even possible to opt out of sharing your data. It is anonymous data, but you can opt out, which we do have some institutions do for various reasons. But of course, we do appreciate when people share the data, because then Sandi and I can have a session like this with you. Now, Sandi, I put my picture up here just because I know what people are thinking. Anytime we offer something and we say it's free, there's an assumption of no value, right?
Has to
And
be a catch.
yeah, there has to be a catch in where we're coming from. So I thought I would at least give some transparency around this so that we establish kind of the why we do this. First of all, we've been doing it a long time. I mentioned we first did this in 2004. That was actually before Help Systems owned the PowerTech brand, who did it originally. And we have done literally thousands of servers over the years. And so I think it's very representative of the IBMI community. As I've mentioned already, the benefit to you is that you get a no-cost review of security performed by an expert in IBMI security. It's not just an auditor who knows Windows that has been given the task of doing an IBMI. We live, eat, and breathe this stuff. There is a benefit to us, right? So there is a reason we do it, and I'll confess it. That is that the review process, if you take us up on that, is a beautiful and perfect way for us to demonstrate expertise. We spend about an hour with you. Doesn't cost you anything, but what better way for us to show you that we do live, eat, and breathe this than actually working through and having that conversation with you. It also gives us an opportunity to identify what you're struggling with and what areas of concern you have when it comes to security, which is great for building out some of the development plans that we have. So there are benefits to us, which is absolutely a big piece of the reason why we do it. I've mentioned already, but contributing the data to this study is both voluntary and anonymous, but all of us appreciate when it happens, and it happens hundreds of times a year when that data comes in. The other reason we do this, Sandi, no one else has ever had the courage to do it. There are certainly opinion-based surveys out there, one or two I've seen in past years, but nobody's actually pulling data from actual IBMI systems. So this is pretty unique in that regard. I'm not aware of any other study like this of its kind, and I think that's part of the reason why so many of you show up to check it out. All right, maybe we're not still got everybody convinced, Sandi. There's perhaps a couple of other reasons. So let's talk about the study itself. So the scan that generates the data is very important because it's available to anybody and everyone anywhere in the world. We don't dictate who runs it and when they run it. We also don't dictate what systems they run it on. So this is influential over the data, for the good and the bad sometimes, in that it could be all partitions in an environment or just one partition. It could be production, it could be test. We have no control. Customers are the ones choosing that they want to do a scan, and they also choose if they wish to share the data. I can tell you for 100% fact, we run a lot more scans than we have data, but certainly we have enough that we can pull this report together every year, and we love that. I do go through the spreadsheet of data and I cleanse it a little bit. What I'm looking for is where customers have run multiple scans of the same system within a 7-day window. When we give use of the software, there is a 7-day grace period to allow everybody to run it on whatever partitions they want. But oftentimes, I don't know when you've seen this, Sandi, customer ran it yesterday, we have this call scheduled for today, they closed out their browser, which is the document, and instead of just reopening it, they run another scan. And so sometimes we find multiple scans coming through, one right after the other, and nothing's different. And we don't want to skew the findings so obviously. So we do cleanse out any repeats, but if there is multiple scans in that 7-day window, I take the latest. The reason being, some customers do absolutely take it to heart. They look at it and they go, "Ooh, I can fix that quick, and I'll rerun the scan." In which case, we want to give them the benefit of the doubt, and we take the latest and greatest. Personal background, I've mentioned some of this, but I've been doing this since 2009 under the Help Systems brand, and I can validate, and I'll let you, Sandi, weigh in if you feel the same way, that even though this isn't the full extent of all the scans we do, it is 100% representative of what the systems look like. This is not the worst of the worst and all the others look great. This is extremely representative. I don't care if you share the data or not, they all basically come in looking very, very similar.
Yep.
I'm also certified in audit and IBM. So again, just as credibility on the background of the analysis of the data, the gathering of the information, and then of course putting it together, which I do with the help of a great marketing team so that we have a pretty document instead of Robin's notepad. So Sandi, let's talk a little bit about IBM security in general. I think one of the biggest questions I get, especially from folks in kind of the press environment, is what's going on with IBM security? Why are we still doing this study after almost 20 years? And why are we talking about some of the same things repeatedly? So the question, I really broke this down into, what has been the main inhibitor to us having better security within IBM? And I break it down to one word: inaction, which is defined as a lack of action where we expect some or where some is appropriate, right? And that is us in the IBM community. We're not world renowned for adopting new features. How many of you out there are still using SEU and PDM to write your CL and RPG code? Right? We've been trying to push people off that platform, and I'm as guilty of it as the next person because I do it too. But we've been trying to push people off of those types of tools, arguably for almost as long as I've been on the system, probably more than 20 years that we've had other options, and we're just not good at grabbing a hold of those things. The other part is the platform has a great reputation. Let's face it, it's deemed highly secure and arguably virus proof. I've heard IBMers even state that, and there is this perception out there. And let's face it, IBM is probably not the cheapest server on the rack. Sure, total cost of ownership comes in very competitive, usually as the winner, but the initial purchase price is higher. And so we often have to cost justify an upgrade or a purchase of one of these servers. And we tend to lean on these virtues that we feel Power has over Windows and Linux and other servers. And that's partly the integrated security. And so we now have to consider, have we been doing our business a disservice if we've been selling it the fact that this Power server can't be hacked, it can't get a virus, it can't be this, it can't be that. And then along comes Help Systems, maybe questioning some of those things. As a programmer early in my career, I wrote lots of commercial grade code and never got a lick of education on how to write programs that were secure or that used object level security. And I would offer the programmers of today rarely get that type of education either. So the bottom line is most of us don't understand security. We just think it's the responsibility of the server, not of the developers. And we all have a role to play. Again, the low risk thing is not just about the technology itself, but it's also based on the fact that the box is typically protected by a firewall. Most IBM servers don't live on the internet. And so if the firewall is there, it's going to stop everybody. But that overlooks the fact that virtually every security incident that happened either occurred inside the firewall, or it did occur inside the firewall, or somebody got through the firewall. You wouldn't hear about all these breaches if a firewall was 100% effective. And I don't know how many of you are still living in the green screen. I love the green screen, but I get that it does open some doors. And we also have to recognize that being on the green screen isn't enough, right? Throwing a menu in front of a user is not necessarily going to solve your problem. And the last bullet I left open-ended. I'm sure there are reasons that I haven't listed here. If you have a great compelling reason you want to share, feel free to send it through the questions, and I'll include it anytime I talk next about this. topic. All right, Sandy, I want to know what folks are doing for security on IBMI. I will tell you shortly. I've done this presentation already today. This is my second pass at this. I'm going to launch the poll here. It kind of came back interestingly to me. You and I haven't had a chance to talk about this yet, but I'm going to share in a moment once people have finished this one. I'll share you what the first one was and who won that. So I'm not going to give you too long here, so answer that quick. I get that you may not know, and you may be working on multiple things, but if there's one primary initiative, I don't know that this lets you pick multiple choices, but let's give you about 5 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, let's close it. All right, I'm going to share that poll with everybody. Now, this morning when I did this, the winner, and it was a clear winner, was malware and ransomware protection. You'll be happy to hear about that, Sandy. Here we have a larger contingent, not really sure, but overall, out of the ones, it's a draw between malware and other. So thank you for responding. That's interesting. We'll talk a little bit more about malware and viruses on I, as I'm sure you can imagine. But yeah, very interesting, and I'm encouraged, as I'm sure you are, Sandy, to see that folks have some initiatives going and that malware is in that list.
Yes, it's a good thing.
Absolutely. So part of this is, each year we do this, we talk about the stats. My encouragement, and I'm doing this a little bit differently over the last couple of years, in that I want to focus in on some of the key elements rather than just regurgitating a bunch of statistics. I want to talk about individual metrics, some of the observations around those, and then some key plans on what maybe you can do to evaluate and act upon it. So let's kind of start this process. First of all, the State of IBMI Security Study is a full report. We're not going to go through the entire thing here today. The edition for 2022 is available. I did post it in the handouts. Hopefully I don't get in trouble with my marketing team that I did that, but I figured, hey, you guys are all here and I'm not going to make you jump through hoops. So quick, go grab that before I get in trouble and they take it down. It's also, of course, on helpsystems.com, and you can grab it there anytime. First thing we looked at, Sandy, was the IBMI operating systems. We were slightly unusual this year in that we didn't have an expiring OS release. There are currently no operating systems with an end of life documented. So that's a little bit different than usual. So if you are under anything other than version 7.3, you are unsupported. If you are 7.3 or over, you are supported. And until 7.5 or whatever it gets called is released, we probably won't have an end of life on 7.3 yet. However, even when that end of life is announced, you'll typically have at least 12 months to transition. So be looking to see kind of where you stand as far as, is that a limit on your hardware? Do you have a game plan? But from a change perspective, what we saw a shift in was a big decrease, or a decrease from the number of people running 7.2, which is good because that went unsupported last year, and an increase in the number of people running 7.4, actually a greater than increase going to 7.4. So some of the 7.3 people transitioned and some of the 7.2 people transitioned. So this is good. We did see some people still running 6.1 to 7.1, probably a hardware constraint would be my guess, but probably not the greatest idea. The considerations that I want to share are that we want you to stay on a supported operating system release because we want you to have access to support from IBM, getting PTFs, being able to call the support line. I understand some of you may have extended support, but it costs money, good money, and sometimes that money is better spent elsewhere. The operating system releases also will continue to introduce enhanced features. Some of the newer things in security for IBMI for 7.3 and enhanced in 7.4 is the authority collection feature, which is designed to help kind of push some of those of us that are hesitant to do more with object level security, which is a great thing. We also get support for up-to-date cipher protocols. So if you're trying to do any encryption, or if you are, as you all should be, using secure connections for your emulation sessions and your navigator connections, then we get better protocols for those SSL TLS connections. If you are on an unsupported version of the operating system, you are probably fighting a losing battle on being able to stay current and patched, even if there is a discovered vulnerability. So things like Log4j come along, and you're going to find yourself a little bit out in the cold. If you are dealing with a regulatory mandate, then there is a good chance that they will dictate that you have to stay only on supported software for all of the reasons above, right? They want you to stay supported because that gives you the best chance at being secure. So our plan of action, pretty straightforward here on the operating system. It's to determine what operating system you're currently on. If you don't know already, there's a command, go license program, that I've bolded here. Take option 10 to display the installed products, and then hit F11, which will toggle the columns and show you the installed release. Now, some products may have different releases, but you want to look for the operating system, and there will definitely be a theme. The vast majority of them will be configured for the installed release of the operating system. If you're not there, consider an upgrade, at least to get as far as you can with the hardware you're on, and have an understanding of how far your hardware will allow you to go. If there is a constraint on the horizon, then at least have some discussion around what's going to happen as that date gets closer. Not relevant right now because we don't have a published end of support for either of the two current operating systems, but here's the URL. If you want to keep tabs on end of marketing, end of support, end of extended support, things like that, there is a table that IBM maintains with that information in. And as part of your maintenance procedures, make sure you are getting PTFs, of course, but there is a security group PTF that needs to be incorporated into that maintenance function so that you get all of those good PTFs included when you maintain your system. The second metrics that I want to share is what I call the security enforcement level. This is managed through a system value known as Qsecurity. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of that. And it's designed to ensure that your user community is being granted the appropriate administrative permissions according to their particular user class. Now, there's some other things that come into play, but that's certainly the big one. At security level 40 and 50, it also directs the operating system to use built-in integrity mechanisms that exist, one of which is called HSP, or hardware storage protection. There are controls that ensure that users can't run jobs as other users. There are controls that ensure that you can't invoke access to an operating system object outside of an API or a command interface. So it's just making sure nobody's abusing the operating system. So what we see, 80% of you passing that test, which is fantastic, but that means 20% of failing. And I've measured that based on a pass if you're running level 40 or 50, and a fail if you're running 30 or below. Level 40 has actually been the default from IBM for over 25 years. Doesn't seem that long, tells me how long I've been on the system. But level 40 is still considered the recommended setting. There is a higher level, level 50, but many of the benefits of being at level 50 over the years have trickled down to level 40. So there's not a huge difference between those two levels. But the big caveat here, the big takeaway on this one, is that there are other factors that will influence how effective that value is in supporting your security. For example, if you're running on a level 40 system and you give all your users all object special authority, that administrative privilege, then effectively your system is operating just as if it was on level 20. If you take all object away from users from a system at level 20, then effectively you're closer to a level 30 machine. Now, interestingly, you go from 40 to 20, but you only go from 20 to 30. The reason is that there are other things that will happen at level 20 that aren't fixed by taking the all object away. So we don't get to go all the way back to 40. All right, so your considerations. Number one, if you're currently at security level 10, please call me. It's one of those things that I'll be sad for you, but it would be exciting to see in my career because I've never seen a system at that level. It is not supported by IBM. If you change off of 10, you can't get back to it. And that's a good thing because it means no security. If you're at level 20, when you go to level 30, what's going to happen is any user who is not a class of StarSecOffer is going to be stripped of their all object permissions. Any user who is not a SecOffer or a system opper is going to have their save sys permission stripped away. So in essence, when we upgrade our security enforcement level, and the next time you IPL, all of a sudden a bunch of admin privileges will be dropped from your profiles based most likely on the user class. If you're currently at level 30 and you want to upgrade to that recommended 40 or even go all the way to level 50, you're going to find that OS integrity is now being enforced, and there are some activities that may be currently being performed that will be blocked. And that tends to freak people out, right? Number one, it takes an IPL, which is time consuming, and I may break something. So here's how you do it. First of all, you determine what your current security level is. And there's the command to do that, just looking at that system value. If you're going to change from level 20 up to level 30, you need to kind of identify which users are going to be impacted based on their user class and determine if removing that authority is going to cause an issue, right? Does the user actually need that permission to do their job? That takes a little bit of work and investigation. Changing the system value won't help you with that, it'll just expose it. If you're going from level 30 to 40, there are two values that you need to include in your audit configuration, and then look for authority failure entries and 6 subcodes. That's getting a little bit techy, but in essence, the operating system is logging violations that are not being enforced. When you get to level 40, they will be enforced. So we get the advantage of try before you buy. You look for those entries. If they're not happening, you're good to go. If they are happening, you can mitigate them before you ever make the change. If you're going to be an overachiever and jump straight from 20 to 40, you've got to consider the impact from both of those changes combined. There is a chapter in the security reference manual that has detailed instructions on what to look for and how to do it, or you can reach out to your friends at Help Systems and we will assist you with that task. It's something we do all the time, and it's very commonplace. Well, no conversation about security would be complete without at least touching on passwords, right? Sandi, I've seen some horrendous stories in things when I've scanned systems as part of my activities. I'm sure you probably have as well. But the big one for me is default passwords. I had a customer yesterday that I looked at that had over 1,000 profiles with default passwords. The average is 146. If we narrow that just to the enabled accounts, it's still 79 on each LPAR, not total across the study. So if you are an IBM shop and you have not looked to see if any of your profiles have a default password, this is something to jump on. Low-hanging fruit for sure, easy to fix, but extremely detrimental when it's found. A default password, for those maybe not familiar, is where the password is the same as the name of the profile. So Sandi, your profile is Sandi and your password is Sandi.
Shh, don't tell.
Yeah, I know. I've just given away half of your accounts, right? Passwords are required always in order to access a user account, and inside that user account, it defines what the user can do, what they see, where they go. So once the user is signed on, it's game on. So the passwords are incredibly important to make sure that we control the user access. It's worth noting, IBM supplied profiles, those that tend to start with the letter Q, do not have to have a password, with one exception, and that's QSecOffer. And when I say it doesn't have to have a password, please don't call or send letters. I have had an auditor yell at me because they said that's unacceptable to have an account without a password. It doesn't mean you can sign on without a password. It means there's no password for the account, and therefore the account cannot be signed on, right? So it is a secure way, and it just means a password star none is the definition. We know that passwords are often the sole protection for the asset itself, whether that's the database or the server. And we want to make sure that that is a kind of a well-constructed thing. No user can pick a default password. So we, for once, as admins, as much as we try to, we can't blame those pesky end users for this. Only admins can establish a password that does not conform to the policy, inclusive of default passwords. If you're sitting there, as I'm sure many of you are, thinking, yes, I do that, but I expire the password when I create the account, so I know the user has to change it when they sign in, what you're missing is that a lot of users never sign in. We see so many of these default accounts, the only way that could happen is if the user never actually connected. So don't assume. Even if you need a default password, I get it, sometimes that's the case, then try to come up with a password default that's maybe unique to your organization rather than the entire world. Even if you have great password policy, don't rest back too much on your laurels, because good passwords are often recycled and reused for many places. My wife, for one, uses the same password in every instant, and I cringe every time she says I can't remember my password, because typically I can guess it from the 300 other accounts. I probably shouldn't admit that, but we know that that's the reality. And even if it's a strong password, if one of those accounts is compromised somehow, somebody like, I don't know, LinkedIn releases all their passwords as they did a number of years ago, then all of a sudden that is now a known strong password, which ends up in a dictionary, and it can be used and compromised elsewhere. The other thing to bear in mind is that a password is not the best thing in the world, because it doesn't prove the user is who they're claiming to be. So we look to technologies like multi-factor authentication to help authenticate that the user is not just entering the password, but they are who they say they are. A plan of action here starts by revealing who has default passwords. And fortunately, IBM gives us a command for that: analyze default password. And that will kick out a spool file that will list all the profiles. Hopefully it's a short list. It should ideally have nothing on it. If you do find people on it, however, though, just direct those people to go change their password, or perhaps better yet, go change it for them. I put expire here. I get it. I'm not a big fan of setting it to expire unless I change it as well. I'm just not wanting to assume that that user will ever sign in. So if you just expire it, it doesn't fix the problem. If you change it and expire it, at least that way the user will get to pick a secret one that you don't know the next time they sign in. But in the interim, the account is still safe. Look for your onboarding procedures. If you're an admin, or if you're in charge of admins, look to see how these accounts are being created. Get rid of the defaults, because as I said, only admins can do it. But if you're on 7.2 or 7.3 or 7.4, you get the benefit of a newer system value called Qpassword Rules, and a couple of values that you can bring to the table combined: limit profile name and all create change. The first one limits that you can't have the user account name anywhere in the password. And the second one says that the rules are applicable to admins. So all of a sudden, the admins now have to comply with the length requirements, and they can't use defaults. So you're going to have to inform and educate them on how to do it, but a much more robust way of establishing passwords. And as I said a moment ago, if it is unavoidable to have a default password, at least don't use IBM's definition of a default. Come up with your own, and that way if somebody gets in from outside, they won't know it. What about admin privileges, Sandy? How many of these do you have on your
Oh,
profile?
I have them all, and so
I
does
do
everybody
too.
else.
Yep, I agree. Now, bear in mind, the numbers above these bars are the averages on each LPAR that we looked at last year. The good news is all object dropped from 300 and I think it was 356, something like that, down to only 244. So it was an improvement. I noted last year that I felt that that 300 and something was an anomaly, because it jumped so dramatically over all of the preceding years, and I couldn't quite figure out what was going on. I looked through the data, I couldn't see a pattern. There were different systems. It's not like one customer ran 50 different LPARs and skewed the results. There really was just no good explanation for why the systems were reviewed previously had so many all object. And so it did go down, but it didn't go down enough. 244 is still dramatically higher than most prior years. Typically it's around the 100, 150 mark. So we're still over 100 profiles on average more than that. This is the keys to the kingdom, folks. You have access to every single file, every program, and even the entire operating system. That includes access to other users' profiles, so you can run as and run the job as them. So even though the other bars in many instances are a little bit shorter than the 244, as an all object user, there's a very good chance I can weasel my way to getting the other 7 special authorities, and therefore I'm back in business as a security officer. I don't know why in the IBMI world we feel compelled to give people administrative privileges. I think a lot of it stems back to days of yore when, yes, we threw the menu in front of the user and we called it good. We're afraid to take these permissions away, right? If we take all object away, all of a sudden the application breaks, or the vendor tells us, oh, you have to have all object. None of that is written in stone. Any application can run with a user without all object, but it may take some architecting. And there's only one thing, I think, Sandy, that people are more afraid of than a data breach, And that's breaking what was working this morning, right? That manual, oops, I did it kind of thing. But there are ways to do this safely. So this is definitely an area of concern, great concern. There are compensating controls that can be effective here. Taking command line permission away is very beneficial, albeit not 100% effective, but it does help and it's easy to implement. So don't just think this is a lost cause. There are definitely things we can do here. I would encourage reduction of these numbers, ideally maybe down to the 10 or teens mark if you're looking for a benchmark. So that 244 is clear over that. The save sys on the far right is a bit of a sneaky one. That one keeps growing every year. I'm not sure why all that is either, because save sys is a pretty clearly defined permission that most people do not need. So the fact that we're giving that to people more and more, very interesting, right? Spool control and job control tend to be the most assigned each year. I said all object blew up last year, but spool control, job control are most consistent. They are a little bit more challenging, and so it's understandable that those are there, but a lot of that stems back to misperception of whether a user needs it. I print, so therefore I need spool control. No, if you're not an admin, you don't need spool control. So we call them special authorities. There's 8 of them, as I've said. They can be gifted to an individual user or they can be assigned to a group. So you want to check both places when you're auditing your system. They're initially granted based on the user class of the profile, but afterwards they can be overridden in any combination. So the user class should not be relied on. Look at it, but you look at your special authority field, it's much more indicative of how powerful the user is. And as a general remark, most users do not need any of these, but those that do typically don't need it all day, every day. First thing I want you to do, generate a printout or build a DB2 table of users that have any of the special authorities. And you can use the display user profile command for that. And then I want you to test by removing unnecessary authorities from users. I get it's scary. We can certainly help with that task if it's intimidating, but it's an objective that I think you should have at least on your whiteboard. Right? Think about a plan for giving out authorities for those that do justify them on occasion on more of an as-needed basis. Some customers do that by having a break glass user profile. Some people sign on as the security officer. I'm not a big fan of that last one because how do I know who did it if we've got 3 people all signing in as QSec offer? There are also commercial tools like Authority Broker in our portfolio that allow a user to elevate their permissions temporarily and then relinquish those privileges when they're done. So there are ways that we can accomplish this task. For those users that are administrative in that regard and that have command line permission, I strongly encourage that you use the auditing capabilities of IBM to log all the commands that the user is entering. Very easy to set that up and easy to do. Consider using tools to assign privileges, to track the use of privileges, and even to manage accounts with single sign-on or multi-factor authentication or other types of provisioning functions, all right? So there are definitely some things here in the operating system as well as commercially. All right, if you've ever heard me speak before, you will probably cringe when you see the word exit program on the screen because you know this is my soapbox. I get very fired up about this topic because to me, it is the easiest thing you can do to secure your system. And yet, as we see, almost 90% of you have not taken this step. So let's define a couple of things. An exit program. It's a program defined function. Means that it's enabling the application to do things that the application programmer didn't originally design. And in this case, what we're interested in is the operating system as that application. The intent of an exit program is to kind of augment the object level security controls for the purpose of overseeing TCP connections like FTP and ODBC. What I want your exit programs to do is give audit visibility, to be able to alert on actions, and then also provide access control capabilities so that if a user comes in through FTP and is normally only a green screen user, we can actually block the user and say, you're not supposed to be coming in through FTP. When we go through security scans with customers, and Sandy, I imagine you'll agree because most of the scans are very similar to one another, but the first control that tends to be deployed by companies are exit programs. And it's for the very simple reason that it is the quickest thing that you can implement that will have the most influence in moving the needle on reducing risk.
Absolutely.
Now, if you want an analogy, I describe exit points and exit programs like Velcro. One is the hook, one is the fuzz. The exit points are part of the operating system. They're embedded throughout the OS. There's dozens of them. About 30 of them pertain to PC connections, though. The exit program is the other side of the Velcro. They're not necessarily security centric. They just do what a programmer codes them to do. And that means they could be malicious technically, but we want that exit program to audit, to alert, and control. This can be a great compensating control if you don't have good security elsewhere, but even if you do have good security elsewhere, you've taken the time to configure your libraries and your objects, an exit program can enforce flexibility, so you can have different access levels for different interfaces. The big takeaway, the acknowledgement that you need to make is these doors, these PC tools running over TCP/IP are the interfaces we see attacked most commonly. And yet these are the ones that we put the least amount of protection around. And that's why this is an important mitigation step. And if you have limited resources, funds, etc., and you say, I'm just going to do one thing, what's the one thing I should do? This is going to be it for me. Hands down, this is the recommendation I would make. So how do you know if you need them? Well, the first thing is to discover if you already have them. Way to do that, run an IBM security scan using the help systems tool. We'll talk more about that later. The other option, the manual approach, is to run a work reg inf command, go down through the list of registered exit points, looking for the IBM QTMF server rec. That is the exit point associated with FTP server functions. I'm picking that one because that is the most common one that people protect. There's lots of others, but if you're going to have an exit program, it's going to be that one before any other. Once you find it, take an option 8, and it'll tell you if there's currently an exit program associated with that exit point. If there is a program, you need to understand what the program is doing, who wrote it, etc. And then you may want to dig a little bit deeper on some of the exit points. If you are lacking an exit program there, chances are you are completely exposed and there's very little digging additionally that needs to be done. So then you need to evaluate an exit program solution, you need to deploy an exit program solution, and then you maintain the rules in an exit program solution. And if I didn't mention it already, get an exit program solution.
Robin, should they get an exit program
I
solution?
really feel strongly that you should have an exit program solution.
I have to concur.
Excellent. All right, next metric. Black box cockpit recorder for your IBM I. Sounds pretty dramatic, but that's what this thing does. It records what's happening on your system. The good news is 78% of you have one. Sadly, 22% if you don't, which means you are completely blind if the thing starts spiraling out of control. You have no visibility into what caused it, right? The operating system has extensive auditing features. You don't have to pay for them, you just turn them on. Granted, there is some implication possibly on the disk, right? So the cost implication is indirect, but it's usually minimal for most people. This capability allows you to audit system activities as well as individual user events, and even when people access certain sensitive objects. If you've heard the term audit journal or QAudjourn, that's what we're talking about. It's the black box. It'd be kind of cool if it was called that, but hey, I didn't get to name it. The actual audit data itself is stored in an object type known as a journal receiver. That's very similar to the database journal receivers you may be using if you do HA or if you've done any disaster recovery. The benefit of a journal receiver is that the type of object makes it not very difficult. It's impossible to remove an individual entry, and you can't alter any of the element of the individual entry. You can delete the entire receiver, but the next entry in the new receiver would show that the person deleted the last receiver. That's usually how it works. So it's a very robust object type for this, and IBM did a good job of picking it. The thing to be aware of, what they didn't really arguably do well, was that the auditing function is dormant when you first install IBM I. So unless you have configured it, it is not turned on, which is potentially why those 22% of people don't have it. I will caution you, if you are part of the 78% and you're sitting there rubbing your hands going, thank goodness I actually succeeded in one, I do want you to be aware of a couple of things. Let's go through some considerations here. Auditing is not typically going to degrade the actual server performance, but it will over time consume disk. Whether that's a little bit of disk or a lot of disk depends on how busy your system is and the type of events you're logging. Auditing can, and I would say should, be tuned. It's not that you have to audit everything or nothing. You can fine tune in this gray space in between. It's worth noting that you can load up tools after an event and interrogate them. However, you can load $1 million worth of software, and if you weren't logging the data in the first place, that tool can't recreate it. So it is absolutely critical that the data be turned on, even if you choose that you're not going to do anything with it at this time. But my suggestion is to have a good policy around that collection. Should you keep it online? Do you need to put it on tape? Is there a mandate that says how much data you have to collect? I was just talking to a PCI customer. PCI is very explicit. You have to have 90 days of that data on the system and up to 365 days worth of that data available either on the system or off the system. It's worth noting, and this is the reason we're so hot on this, is you can detect a security violation if the auditing's not active. You won't know if somebody's trying to hammer their way through a brute force attack on your user profiles, most likely. You're not going to know if somebody's trying to access the payroll file outside of the payroll application. If you have high availability, there's a good chance you're part of the 78%, but this is the caveat. When HA turns the auditing on, it turns it on with a very selfish perspective. It typically purges the data the next day, and it doesn't necessarily configure all of the necessary elements that we want if we're security oriented. So HA will help. It'll get the data flowing, and it looks good on the report because you get the check mark. But in reality, it's not doing you any good, and that's a problem. So what's your plan of action? Well, first of all, find out if the black box exists. Do a work object looking for QAudjourn in library QSys. It is a fixed name in a fixed library. You have no choice. So if that object exists, then you've got a starting point. If that object doesn't exist, auditing has never been activated. If it's been activated at some point, you've still got to determine if it's currently active. So now we've got to switch gears and we've got to look at a few system values. QAud control, the first one here under works as val, is the on-off switch. There are 3 possible values. I encourage you to have all 3. If you have less than 3, you want to clearly understand that to make sure you got the right ones. After that, once the audit has been determined as currently active, the audit level and the audit level 2 are 2 system values that will indicate the type of events that are being logged. And you want to make sure that you have the requisite events being acknowledged there. And again, there are some expectations of what it should be and how that should be set up. So reach out to us or check out one of the recorded webinars we have on helpsystems.com talking about audit config. If you don't already have a plan just to fire that up, don't send the data to QGPL, which is where it wants to send it by default. Send it to a custom library. If you're already auditing, we can redirect it. That's not a problem. But QGPL, general purpose library, is a horrendous place for something as important as this. And then ideally, once you have the data collected, consider a method that will alert you to an event that happens or report at least on what's going on, which are activities typically best served through third-party software. And again, Help Systems has some great solutions in that regard for reporting, syslogging, et cetera, so that you can make good use out of the data that you're now collecting. Now, Sandi, I'm losing my voice here, but you're the antivirus expert that we have on staff. So you know what, I'm gonna make you go through this one because this topic I know has been near and dear to your heart for probably more years than you care to admit. And it's
Yeah,
evolving, right? And so I think this
absolutely.
is probably, in my opinion, the biggest misinformation around IBMI outside of the system is secure, quote unquote. This is probably the most controversial and misunderstood section. So why don't you clue us in as to the reality of this?
Yeah, absolutely. So, virus protection is probably one of the most misunderstood and underutilized controls on the IBMI. And, it really started with IBM determining that this was actually something that was important, needed to be done. And they actually added controls starting back at V5R4 to enable the ability to do virus protection.
Wait, so
And
IBM acknowledged this? IBM has admitted that you can
they
get a virus on I?
did. Crazy enough.
All right, well then
Uphill
folks,
battle on education here, but it is a true statement.
yep, so that's the proof in the pudding, right? As IBM says, yes, it can happen.
Yep, 100%. They actually added an entire infrastructure to support it. System values to exit points, going back to exit points, but also attributes on stream files to actually keep track of your scan status of the files. So they really felt it was important enough to create the entire infrastructure for it. So, and with that, they never, they've never claimed that the IFS is virus proof. This is something that they said, yeah, you know what, there is a possibility here. And because the IFS is not optional, it has to be existing in order for the system to function. They decided that they needed to add these controls. But unfortunately, as you can see from the security study from last year, we still got a lot of folks that don't really realize that this is a valuable control on the system and a necessary one. Although I understand, Robin, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is actually number has increased since last year.
Yeah,
We
so
actually
the,
have
the
more people.
absolutely. So the graph that I put on here is a measure of how many of the systems were configured with some kind of scan mechanism associated with file open, the most common way I think we see people implementing a commercial scan engine. It was 10% in 2021, it's now 15%. So while this does look kind of dire at first glance, as we've seen, malware and ransomware protection was the most common initiative for you guys. It was also the most common initiative for the EMEA region. And so this is definitely a growing space. You guys are doing a good job at catching on, acknowledging, talking about and discovering how this works for you. And this is definitely an important topic to cover. So under considerations, the most common way that we see viruses coming into play, drive mappings, right? Mapping a drive, dragging a file, it's infected. And yes, I know you have antivirus on your PC, but it's not fail safe. You can get 0-day infections. You've got files coming in from outside. And so we've just got to acknowledge that they can get there. The good news is that native objects like RPG programs and physical data files are immune from infection, but that does not mean that they are not impacted. And I've been telling people that for years, and I'm sure you have, Sandy, but I actually had, true story, customer yesterday, having a conversation with them in general from a security scan, and we talked about viruses. And they said they were actually hit with ransomware last year. They had a root share mapped to their IFS, which is a big no-no, but it actually did encrypt files that were part of the JVM, and so they had all kinds of issues, but it actually scrambled DB2 data in their files. They weren't encrypted, but they were caused issue. And so that was the first time in a while that I've had anybody where the DB2 structures were actually impacted as well. So we've got to acknowledge objects, even that are arguably immune from infection, can still be renamed. They can be moved. They can be deleted, right? And so there's definitely do's and don'ts around the IFS in general. If you've invested in high availability, kudos to you. It replicates those desired acts and gives you a backup machine. But consider that it also replicates bad things like viral actions and infections. So high availability can leave you in a scenario where both boxes have the same issue at the same time. And many of us just don't plan for that, right? Those viruses are not specially written for IBM. I don't think that there's somebody in Russia or North Korea that is planning an attack on IBM. They're just writing viruses and malware. And it can be the same viruses on Windows. So don't think that we're special just because we're a little bit off the radar. My comment to people, if they're still kind of scratching their head going, yeah, but IBM created that virus protection and they created it for a reason. What they did, however, is leave out a piece of the puzzle, and that's why most people don't know that capability exists. You still have to add the scan engine, which fortunately Help Systems has through a partnership with McAfee. So this is an easy item to check off. If you're dealing with PCI regulations, this is mandated, and there are a number of other regulations that say thou must be protected as well, right? And if you want lots of other horror stories, Sandy, I'm sure you could sit around the campfire and roast marshmallows and tell these stories till the sun comes up, because I know there's quite a lot of them.
Definitely.
So plan of action, golden rule, never share the root folder. I can't emphasize that enough, right? Pick out actually what IFS shares you do have defined, and you can tell that through Navigator. Try to make those shares read-only where possible, although that's not going to save you 100%, but it does help. Right? If you are sharing the root folder, which I've already told you not to do, take advantage of the special authorization list named QPWF server, which controls access to the qsys.lib structure, which is where your operating system lives and all of your native applications. From any user who who doesn't have all object. So we can use that authorization list as kind of a secondary protection mechanism. Don't rely on it, but it is helpful there in case somebody subsequently does breaks the golden rule and maps a drive without you realizing it, and all of a sudden you've got exposure. This way, at least your OS is protected. Then I want you to evaluate and deploy a native antivirus engine. I bolded or capitalized that because I don't want you scanning from a share folder. Don't be using your PC going, oh, I'll just map a drive and scan that way. That can be horrendous. And there's about a dozen reasons you don't want to do that, not least of which the impact on your network bandwidth. And then our old friend, the exit programs, you're never going to get me off of that topic. Control IFS access to the file server exit point. So I can see who's mapping drives in. I can see whether they're creating stream files, deleting stream files. It's not an antivirus in that instance, but it's controlling behaviors. And when we partner that up with the native antivirus engine, then we are much better protected than normally we would be otherwise. Anything you want to add on viruses, Sandi, in the last 30 seconds here?
You can't ignore it. It needs to be taken care of. There's some additional exposures from ransomware that, you know, this is something that has to be addressed. And I think from the other marketplace study showed that this is finally high enough on people's radar to start addressing.
Yeah. And the help system solution will help you with both traditional viruses and ransomware. We've done some enhancements to that. So if you're familiar with the solution from before, there are some new enhancements in that I think you'll be very interested in. And again, a quick win and an easy thing to do. I will acknowledge not high risk for everybody, but it's certainly a conversation everybody should have to determine where they fall on that risk spectrum. And a lot of people are more at risk than they initially anticipate. Now we're running out of time here, obviously. There's lots of other things in the study that get revealed, who has command line permission, the minimum password length. We're getting there slowly, but the most common value is still 6-character passwords. I could probably break that in a couple hours if I have enough horsepower. So there are other things that I would encourage you to take a look at throughout the security study and talk to somebody, do some research, understand what these metrics mean and how they influence the security itself. But as I said, we're running out of time for today. Of course, arguably, we're running out of time in general. If you haven't experienced a security incident yet, it's probably coming at some point. So we want to make sure that you're best prepared for that. There is a new motivator if you haven't had one before. The CIS organization has published benchmarks for IBM I 7.2, 7.3, and 7.4. Peer reviewed. I was part of this process. It's a best practice in essence, and it is scoreable, measurable, so that you can look at your system. But it is free and public, which is good for you, but it's also bad for you because it means the audit community is getting smarter and the bad guys have access to it too. So I want you to go out and grab those benchmarks. I want you to become more familiar with your IBM I system, partner with companies like Help Systems, and make sure that you are best protected before the bad guys understand where these common vulnerabilities are. So I promised 3 takeaways. We're going to give you the main ones here just because of time. First of all, the threat of a security incident not going away, right? We saw the cost of a data breach increase last year. We saw the number of breaches incurred last year also went up quite dramatically. Work from home did not help that at all. But even as we start to trickle back into the office, I don't think you're going to see that plummet. We've got too much going on the world stage that revolves around cyber attacks and cyber threats that I think it's here to stay and to continue to grow. Yes, power, IBM I, fantastic combo. What a great deal. But it's a foundation. It doesn't mean that the security is automatically configured. It's a tool that we can use, and it's up to you to implement those changes, right? And speaking of changes, you can do little things that will actually have a massive amount of difference. Taking command line permission away from a user does actually have a lot of impact and a lot of effect. It's not 100% effective. We can't stop there, but things like that don't cost you a dime. They're very easy to do, low risk of breaking the application, and we're good. All right, Sandi, I had to throw this one in there because the other day I bought a box of nuggets and I counted them up and there was an extra one in the box. And I was so excited. It's the little things in life. So I thought I would throw an extra takeaway in here for you guys. And that is that I want you to start inventorying your security settings right away. It's great to know kind of where you're at because that will give you a better understanding of where you need to go tomorrow. All right. let's wrap up. There is a security scan that feeds the study. I've got the link here, but you know what? I'm going to throw out a poll here real quick, just as we wrap up here. If you are interested in running the security scan, no cost, no obligation. As I said at the beginning, you're welcome to sign up for that. If you just want to know more information about it so you can make a more informed decision, let us know that too. If you did one at least a year ago, you're welcome to run another. We still won't charge for it. You can take advantage of that. If you're not interested right now, but you think later on that that's something to do, you can go out to helpsystems.com and you can sign up from there. All right. Let me go ahead and close that out. 3, 2, 1. All right. All right. So the takeaway on the commercial side of it, a whole slew of solutions. I'm not here to sell you stuff. I just want you to be aware that Help Systems is well positioned in this regard with everything from encryption to antivirus to just doing those vulnerability assessments in different capacities. But it's not just software either. We do have software people, of course, but we also have people that are experts in the operating system. They can help you with assessing, pen testing, designing security, and even managing security on an ongoing basis if you want it. All right. I'm going to pause just to see if there's any questions. I'm looking here real quick. Should auditors have command line access? Ooh, interesting, Susan. Should auditors have command? Well, auditors kind of have to have command line access in order to run security commands like analyze default password, things like that. What I would rather see is two things. The auditor provide a list of things that they want to know, and somebody in IT or in the security community of the organization provide that to the auditor. Otherwise, the reason I hesitated a little bit is there's a tool in our portfolio called Compliance Monitor. I think, Susan, you're familiar with that, but it is a tool that is by design not going to allow changes. So it will identify vulnerabilities. It will not allow that person to mitigate them. And that's sometimes desirable, not desirable, depends on your objective. We have other tools that do allow that mitigation. But in the case of Compliance Monitor, the audience for that during its initial design was the audit community initially. And so we didn't want people clicking a button and making changes to the system without going through change control. So it allows an auditor to gather the data they need without needing access to the backend server, running commands and potentially coloring outside the line. So that's, I think, a good option for people if they need those users on the system, but they don't really want those users on the system. All right, I know we're a few minutes over, so I appreciate everybody's patience, and we'll call it good there. If you do have a question in the panel, I'll make sure we go through and we answer that offline. But thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure, and this is always a fun topic to cover, an important topic, and hopefully you guys take some of this stuff to heart. And by the time we come around to next year, we'll continue to see even minimal improvement, but hopefully great improvement over where we are as an IBMI community, and we'll go from there. So until then, take care, everybody. Thanks a lot, Sandi, for giving us some of that info, and we'll talk to you all again soon.
Thank you, Robin.